Welcome and thank you for standing by. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode until the question and answer session, when you may press star 1 on your touch-tone phone to ask your question. Today's conference is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. I'd like to turn the meeting over to Mr. Leland Milstein. Sir, you may begin.
Thanks very much, and thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon for the ACT webcast series. The ACT webcast series is a monthly webcast held at the lunch hour. The trainings leverage local successes by amplifying to a larger audience two model organizations' methods, materials, and approaches. Sessions are planned to last no more than 1 hour, with two presenters speaking on the same topic from slightly different perspectives, each for 10 to 15 minutes, followed by 10 to 15 minutes of questions and answers. Today's session is approved by the ISA for 1 CEU hour and by SAS for 1 CFE Category 1. If you've already given me your certification number, please email me after the session. That way we can make sure you get your credit. Also, most state landscape architecture boards require only a certificate of completion, which ACT can provide to anyone who would like one. So again, email me after the session if you need one of those. This is a program of the Alliance for Community Trees. We're a national network of local organizations and government agencies dedicated to promoting the well-being of our urban forests. If you aren't a member already, please consider joining. Take advantage of resources like today's webcast. I want to thank our sponsors for the webcast series, the Home Depot Foundation, and the USDA Forest Service. Today's session is Storms over the Urban Forest, Part 1, Natural Hazard Management Planning. Natural disasters can wreak havoc on the lives and landscapes of impacted communities. Hurricanes, floods, ice storms, tornadoes, and other serious natural hazards have the potential to devastate cities large and small, and to destroy the urban forest in the process. Natural hazard management presents the tools to properly prepare for and respond to the threat of major storms, beginning with a right tree, right place approach for planning prior to planting. Coordinated efforts among city leaders and urban forestry managers, including elected officials, nonprofits, municipal agencies, utilities, tree care companies, and citizen foresters, can help minimize damage by and to trees during natural disasters. We're lucky to have with us today two experts who are experienced in this field. First up today is Alessandra Gerolman, a senior hazard mitigation planner at Witt Associates, who's also the executive director of the Natural Hazard Mitigation Association. She sits on the executive committee of the American Society of Public Administration's section on emergency and crisis management. Alessandra has been responsible for mitigation consulting and the development of various emergency management plans and programs, including work on the city, county, and state levels in Louisiana, New Jersey, Georgia, Mississippi, and Oklahoma. She was recently awarded the 2009 PTAC Prize by the American Society of Public Administration for the best paper in emergency management. Alessandra has acquired wide-ranging experience in the private, nonprofit, and academic sectors, and we're very happy to have her here today to share some of that experience with us. Thanks so much for joining us, Alessandra.
Good afternoon, everybody. What I'll be talking about today is really the hazard mitigation component and how to try to work with emergency management in the community so that in emergency management, planners and responders and the various folks involved can come to see trees as more of a resource and less of a nuisance. I think it's very important that we find a way to do so, and I think that that benefits those communities. That said, my background is hazard mitigation planning. I'm not an urban forester, so what I can talk about is the mitigation component and some of the literature that's out there, and I'd like to ask the folks listening after this session if you have any resources you're aware of that I didn't mention. I would greatly appreciate your sharing those with me because I do get questions all the time that relate to these issues. Briefly, what I would like to talk with you about today is first, working with emergency management, and in some communities that's really broader than just an emergency management department, but also the folks involved in that, planning with a huge wide range of stakeholders in the community. Also talk following an event, what some things to take into account, looking at trees, what are the damages, and so on and so forth. And then specific things related to hazard mitigation and havoc. What do we know now in the literature? Do we know from folks' experience? And then I'll share a brief list of publications that I use as sources that might be useful references to folks. Working with emergency management, to begin with, and what are some of the advantages from an urban forestry perspective in becoming involved in these planning initiatives and really adding more to your workload? But certainly by working with various stakeholder groups in that community, it can actually help you to build support for an urban forestry management program, and that support can sometimes even take the form of funding, because there are a lot of direct advantages to emergency management, to planning departments, from having that relationship and being able to use some of your expertise as folks involved in urban forestry. And having those relationships built ahead of time before an event can be very valuable and really help to make things a lot smoother. And certainly following a large event, following a hurricane, for example, folks who work in urban forestry are most probably going to get called upon to assist with some of the issues around cleanup, restoration, replanting, and so on. So having those relationships ahead of time can help to avoid misunderstandings and confrontations. Because, again, oftentimes to emergency managers, when they're working in planning, trees are a little bit of a nuisance. They fall over, they take down power lines, they cause all sorts of trouble. And so it's important to show them what some of the benefits can be of urban forestry management. So that takes me to the next piece, which are, what are some of those advantages? Well, to begin with, cities and municipalities can reduce liability from tree damage, and this is damage from trees in the event of a natural hazard event, if they've taken some steps on the front end to try to do good maintenance and plant smartly, the right tree, right place, and right space, including hazard considerations. There are also great benefits from trees, from urban forests, that I certainly don't need to tell you about, such as benefits to the floodplain, to water quality, to the economy, to people's quality of life, and so on and so forth, but making sure that that really is articulated to those folks involved in the planning mechanism. And also from the emergency management perspective, from the recovery perspective, reducing the cost and impact from tree damage by preventing it in the front end can really be quite beneficial. So how do we do this? There are a lot of planning mechanisms already in place. Those include hazard mitigation planning, which is really all about trying to figure out what can happen and what you can do about it in terms of reducing impacts, reducing damages, reducing vulnerability. And that planning process involves a wide range of stakeholders, but often doesn't involve folks who deal with urban forestry. And so trying to play a role in a process and have a seat at that table can be very beneficial. And I would say that quite often you'll be welcomed with open arms. It's quite possible that that committee and those groups just have not thought to include you. And also in some of the emergency operations planning and the response planning, assisting with knowing how to deal with damage from trees, dangling tree limbs, things along those lines, in a way that does not damage the tree further. That is also, I would say, very beneficial. So following an event, and this is taken from a publication by the LSU Ag Center, which is listed in my resources, are 3 suggested things to do. To begin with, to assess the damages. Was the tree healthy to begin with? What are the extent of damages? And was the location of that tree appropriate? Is it a tree in an urban area that perhaps has been overcrowded? And in particular, looking at following a hurricane, certain things to watch for include major limbs damaged or lost, and is more than 50% of the branches lost? How large are the wounds? Are they ragged? Basically, how well is this tree going to be able to heal, or is it really just going to be waiting for the next event, the next windstorm, to finish dying and cause further damages? The second step then is to make a decision regarding trees. keepers, borderline, or trees that need to be removed, and some things to consider. A tree that should be a keeper might have only slight damage, and a borderline tree might be a very valuable tree and otherwise relatively healthy, and a tree that needs to be removed, and certainly a tree that's already dead or has lost most of its leafy crown, a rotten inner core, and so on. And then some considerations after a flood is to try to prevent damage from insects and diseases, to make sure that broken limbs and dead trees are removed and destroyed quickly, and also trying to take steps to prevent additional wounds. And that's where having a pre-existing relationship with the community that's doing some of the response planning and the folks that are going to be coming in and doing some of the cleanup can be very beneficial to making sure that that's done in the best way possible to help ensure the health of the tree. And finally, the third step is to go ahead and give first aid, certainly, to the keepers and the borderline trees, and that can include things such as appropriately removing broken branches, staking, and certainly no topping, and always considering safety. There are a lot of considerations that need to come into account at down power lines in the area. If volunteers are being used, how familiar are they with the tools being used and the best way to be of assistance, and so on. Specific considerations to keep in mind, certainly a site evaluation prior to planting, what base is available now, what might future development look like in that area, how is that going to impact the space available, what is the proximity to infrastructure, for example, to things such as power lines that might be affected if there is damage to a tree in the future. And then in tree selection, taking certain things into account, what will the mature size be, and giving preference to native trees that are more likely to fare well under conditions in that area. And some further considerations include things such as wind resistance. We know some about wind resistance in the literature and from previous experience. Certainly slower growing trees seem to have stronger wood characteristics, and trees with high wind resistance tend to be characterized by wide spreading branches, a lower center of gravity, smaller leaf size, and planting them in groupings can also be beneficial. Some examples of trees with higher wind resistance are the southern magnolia, the live oak, cypress, and palms. And in the resources that are provided at the end, there are some longer list by species that provide a great deal more information. And then tolerance to flooding. There are certain adaptations that the trees may have, such as lenticels, that allow them to better survive floods because they facilitate gas exchange. There is also some information available from research on how different tree species do with flooding, but it's a little more difficult to come up with a list than it is for high wind, because there's a great deal of variability depending on the type of the flood, the duration of the flood, the maturity of the tree, the health of the tree, and so on. Some work out of North Dakota has a list of trees that, when established, seem to have a higher ability to withstand soil saturation and surface ponding. And some examples of trees that in that area have done well for more than 3 weeks of flooding are cottonwoods and willows. And finally, keeping maintenance in mind, because certainly a healthy tree is going to fare much better in an event, and that includes considerations of things such as the health of the root zone and proper pruning. Here's the list of publications I primarily used. I can certainly make any of these available, and as I mentioned before, if anybody is aware of anything further, I would very much appreciate getting access to that information and learning more, because with the Natural Hazards Mitigation Association, we certainly do get questions about this kind of thing, and being able to build a community of experts and provide folks with the best information available is always very important. With that, if we can open it up to questions, that's pretty much the overview that I hope to provide.
Great. Thanks so much, Alexandra. Daniel, I would like to open the line up for questions now.
Thank you to all participants. If you'd like to ask a question, please press *1. Please unmute your phone and record only your name clearly when prompted. We'll wait a few moments to see if we have any questions.
Great. I also want to remind people that you can ask your questions online using the Q&A tab at the top of your screen. So if you don't want to ask over the phone, you can type those into me, and I will ask them out loud for you. Before we get going, I just want to ask you quickly a little bit, Alessandra, I know you've had so much experience working with all different sectors in the planning that you've done. What are your recommendations for the best way to, for sort of nonprofits who are dedicated to urban forestry, and also sort of maybe city government officials to work together to plan well for a natural hazard?
I think to begin with, the more that you can be informed of what is already going on in terms of planning and emergency management, that from there you can see where there are clear gaps and where you might be able to help to provide additional information and really serve as a resource for emergency management. The folks that are involved in doing things such as writing hazard mitigation plans are faced with a pretty big and a pretty daunting task of trying to figure out what can happen from various disasters, from various events, and what they can do about it. But they're looking at so many things. They're looking at protecting the community as a whole, protecting structures, infrastructure, the economy, vulnerable populations, so on and so forth. And so any time that you can be a resource, I would venture to say that you'll get a relatively warm welcome just as a result of that. And trying to participate when there are public meetings, and also just trying to go out and actually meet with the planners in the community, the emergency manager, and learn a little more about what they're doing. And sometimes there are voluntary groups that you can be involved with as well.
Okay, great. Daniel, do we have any questions on the line?
At this time, I show no questions.
Great. Well, I'll start taking them from over the web. First one is, to what degree should municipalities extend the service of tree damage evaluation to private properties? Or, to rephrase it, to what degree are the experts within the municipalities required to provide this service as part of the general welfare of the community? So I think if that wasn't, just to sum that up, basically, how do we extend municipal tree evaluations to private properties? Is that something you've dealt with in the past?
I've seen the question come up, but I really haven't seen municipalities do that very often unless you had trees on private land that were of a sufficient size and proximity to infrastructure where they could cause damage and heartburn to the community, in which case sometimes it does make sense for the municipality to step in and provide assessment and assistance on the front end as opposed to trying to deal with the results afterwards. And certainly, where is that line of responsibility? A tree on public land is to some extent of responsibility, and there have been legal cases where trees on public lands that may not have been maintained have caused damages to private property, and municipalities have been held liable. So there is that concern there as well.
Great, thanks. Next question is, after a natural disaster and the need to submit FEMA reports, has there been a form developed particularly for tree compensation? I
am not certain if there is a form or not, and I could certainly look into that, and it may well be that somebody in our membership would be aware of that. One of the publications that I referenced, and if you pardon the sound of me digging through papers for a second, I can probably figure it out pretty quickly. There we go. It was the Making Our Urban Forest Safer publication, and there's a link to that I believe everybody can see right now. That publication actually does have some language on how to account for tree damages and debris removal and some of the funding mechanisms related to that. Not a great deal, but it has a little bit of information that might give you.
Great. Another question. What's the best way to get the participants of the Office of Emergency Management to sort of respect the importance of tree issues when often, like you said, they are very focused on important concerns like police, fire, ambulance issues?
Sure. I think it really comes down to the most basic question of what's in it for me. And quite frankly, folks in emergency management have a lot on their plate and a lot that seems more pressing than planning. It can be challenging even as a mitigation planner to sometimes get folks in emergency management to move a little bit away from the response considerations to looking at the benefits of planning ahead of time and reducing some of the need for the response. And I think that that's really the angle to take. I think emergency managers are very aware of the difficulties of dealing with downed trees, downed limbs, and all of those events, all of those issues following a storm, especially with all of this ice that we've just had, is a great example. It's like a good time to come in and say, this was a pain, wasn't it? Can we work together to try to make sure this doesn't happen? How can we get on the front end to do appropriate maintenance and so on to minimize damages and make your job easier? And at that point, I think that you would find a more positive response.
Excellent. Do we have any questions on the line? Daniel?
I show no questions at this time.
Okay, great. I do have an offer over the phone, over the internet, and this is from William Jones, who is offering, he has copies of Urban Tree Risk Management, a USDA Forest Service publication. He has many of these copies of this document, and he could mail it to anyone. It's in full color, 3-hole punched, and if you're interested, you can email me, and I can give you his contact. We will also include this in the resource list we put together, which will be available in about a week, that will cover all kinds of publications and documents and other resources related to this topic. Our question here over the line, could you address the role of hazardous tree assessment and removal as part of a scheduled tree pruning and maintenance program, sort of as a way of building mitigation into the routine urban forestry program? And I know you're not so familiar with urban forestry practices, but how would you build sort of hazardous tree assessment into a general schedule of looking at trees, checking them, doing pruning and things like that?
One thing I would say is that if you are working with the hazard mitigation planning process, that is a process that has a built-in, basically, yearly assessment of what has changed in terms of the risk, what has already been done, what needs to be done. And it seems to me that that could be tied in as well, that if you're doing an assessment of the urban forest, that if that coincides, it's a good opportunity to identify potential needs and get them worked in to that process. And again, in some cases, there might even be opportunities for funding for some of that maintenance if it's directly tied in.
Okay, great. What do you think is a fair timeline after a disaster to deal with problem trees after your resources have already been stretched so thin?
That's a great question, and there is so much variability among disasters that it's very difficult to say. I mean, certainly in a very large event, such as a significant hurricane, then there are very pressing, immediate life safety issues and other things that are going to be at the forefront. And I would say that the suggestion is made by the LSU Ag Center publication that I referenced, that the trees be essentially categorized and an initial assessment and then categorization as part of that. Depending on the availability of resources, you can also try to make a preliminary determination of what that timeline is, how quickly do you need to move in order to essentially save the trees that you're going to try to save. But of course, that's restricted by availability of staff and resources and everything else. Perhaps there are folks who have a little more experience with this, who could speak to best practices and timelines. I didn't see a great deal of that in literature, beyond certainly wanting to try to begin as soon as possible.
And I think Anna is actually going to have some very good experience talking about these very issues. If we don't have any other questions over the line, do we, Daniel?
Not at this time.
Then I think we're ready to move on to the sort of counterpart and complementary presentation, giving us sort of a local example of how things have gone on on the ground in Tulsa. Next up is Anna America, who is Executive Director of the nonprofit organization Up With Trees in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Since joining in 2007, Anna has grown the organization, more than doubled the number of trees planted annually, and launched many new programs. Prior to her tree planting work, Anna served as communications coordinator for the city of Tulsa, working in the public works and parks departments, and as a special aide to Tulsa Mayor Kathy Taylor. With roots in journalism and a history working at newspapers in Tulsa and Washington, D.C., Anna is also an engaged community volunteer, dedicating her time to youth activities, neighborhood association work, and all kinds of great causes. Anna holds a bachelor's in communications with a minor in political science and history from the University of Tulsa, and we are very glad to have her here this afternoon to tell us about how they handled quite a difficult urban forest situation after a storm a few years ago.
Thank you, Lee.
Anna.
Thank you. And like Alessandra, I'm not a certified urban forester, and I'm not a mitigation expert, but as you said, we have had to deal with some situations here in Tulsa, and from the nonprofit side of things, I think there's a lot that we can learn and do it better as we move forward. And just to tell you guys a little bit about us, at Up With Trees, we are a nonprofit here in Tulsa. We've been around about 34 years, and we primarily plant trees, but we also do community education, promoting urban forestry. We do some maintenance on many of our trees, ongoing maintenance, and preserve, promote, and protect the urban forest are our goals. And to give you, some of you are probably familiar, especially those who work in hazard mitigation with the city of Tulsa. We about 390,000 people, but what's the real challenge here in Tulsa is that we are sort of at the crux of about every environmental and weather extreme that you can get. We have both hard freezes and drought. We have flooding rains, and we'll go days without seeing a drop in the summer. We have tornadoes, ice storms, windstorms, and just about everything. And in fact, with this blizzard that hit a couple weeks ago, we had both record snows, record lows. In fact, one day last week, I think a week ago today, it was 31 degrees below in Nowata, Oklahoma, and that's not wind chill, that's temperature. It was 31 degrees below at the South Pole that day. And today we were supposed to hit 79 degrees. So it's a tough place to plant trees and to raise trees. The storm in particular that I'm going to showcase, talk a little bit more about today, was what's been deemed the worst natural disaster in Tulsa's history. An ice storm in December 2007, and the combination of weather about a particularly thick area without power, and many of those people power. And most of those outages were caused by tall trees and with. There's a few pictures that just show you it was an amazing view. It was an amazing thing to live through. You can see in these pictures it was gorgeous. I mean, it was a really beautiful thing, but and it looked this way for days. We had this ice over everything. We realized almost right away. I mean, everybody was worried about the power and getting heat and getting access to things, but we knew almost immediately that the real significant damage was going to be to the city's trees. We don't have an actual count, but we know that we lost tens of thousands of trees in that storm. They were either immediately, knocked down or destroyed, or they were so severely damaged that they either had to be removed pretty quickly, or they died within a couple of years because they were so damaged. We actually suffered minimal damage on our trees because of the relatively young age. Where we saw more damage was in the older neighborhoods and city parks where we had larger and older trees. And in some of those, the trees were just, it's like somebody had come and stepped on them and just crushed them. We, the first thing, of course, was focusing on tree removal, just the emergency. I mean, we had to get out there. We had to clear access to streets. We had to, particularly hospitals and emergency vehicles. and it was a monumental task. Homeowners were encouraged and were able to, for the most part, drag the limbs and the branches to the curb, and we were able to get working through FEMA. We were, of course, declared a natural disaster, and so we had FEMA in pretty quickly, and we had contractors working to try to drag that. A lot of people disposed of it on their own, but we had a vast site where tree debris was brought. We ended up having more than 2.7 million cubic yards of tree waste. This is an aerial view. It's a city park, and it would then be mulched into wood to waste that would be used as mulch, and a lot of that was shipped out from the state as part of that, but it was an incredible, it completely took over that park. The one upside, if you will, that came out of this, and in some ways that part of it has been very positive, is I think that it really highlighted for the community how much we value the trees. Tulsa, this area, we call it green country, and people really tie those trees into the identity of the community. And it also highlighted the need for those of us who care about this issue to work together and both with a specific disaster, but also as we look forward, what are ways that we can, more effectively use our resources. And that was, of course, the city and county governments, but neighborhoods and the higher education institute, the businesses in town that work in this facility, and of course, Public Service Company, which is the power company here, has a key interest in this. One of the very first needs that came up, and I think this is something that if we had thought more in advance, we could have done some preparation for, was a vast need for education with the homeowners. And you had a couple of questions earlier talking about that. I mean, there were no resources really available from a public standpoint, that was through the city or FEMA or anything else to help the homeowners and private businesses figure out what they should do. And we were, all of us, getting inundated with calls of people just trying to figure out, should I cut this tree down? How do I do that? Do I need to call somebody to help me? So we pretty quickly, we Up With Trees kind of brought together some of the different players, and that, our county extension offices, city of Tulsa forestry staff, PSO foresters, people who worked in private industry, and we set up a series of free workshops across the city, every part of town, 2-hour workshops, and kind of to our surprise, they were pretty much sold out, if you will. I mean, standing room only. We had over 1,000 people who attended, and we focused on those exact questions. How to decide if a tree could be saved, how to assess the amount of damage and if you were going to need to have the tree taken down. If it could be saved, how to trim damaged limbs, and when to figure out that if you could do that or if you needed to call in a professional. And then probably the most important from my perspective was, once you got past that stage, how do you replace those trees by planting? And I know we use that all the time, but this storm really highlighted for us the importance of planting the right tree in the right place. I'm sorry, I missed my click there. At the same time that we were doing that and the cleanup was going on, the city in particular had to get right out there, and the assessment was a big part of obviously what's going to happen. And I know you guys are bigger experts on this than me, but one thing that made a tremendous difference for them was typically FEMA would have had to have come in order to pay for the trimming or the removal on any of these trees, would have had to gone through and literally tree by tree assess each of these trees. Because the city of Tulsa had been able to get, and they'd gotten in the previous year, a grant, and they'd gone through and had GPS almost all trees that were on city parks and city property. They were able to use that. It's kind of a pilot project that FEMA let them do, and they had gone in before FEMA got on the ground to do the assessments and put in damage estimates and, which trees needed to be removed. And that tremendously, I think, saved time and money in that process. And they were able to get out there and start working on these much quicker. And even though that saved time, shown here in this picture, and I think somebody mentioned earlier, too, about how quickly you get to trees. I mean, this shows you that it was months later. People were in parks. The daffodils are coming up, and we still had piles of trees and tree debris around. From my standpoint, the most significant thing by far that came out of the storm was as I said, the commitment to trees as a community. There was a little concern right at the beginning that people would see trees as the bad guys. They were part of what caused the power out, but it was quite the opposite. It was really a a wake-up call to people that these trees matter to them. And within a few days after the storm, I was meeting with Kathy Taylor, our mayor at the time, and to talk about that and figure out what could we do. We agreed that the loss of trees would be have a significant impact on Tulsa in terms of, you know, the livability, economic impact, all kinds of things. So we worked on a program that we developed called Regreen Tulsa. And this was a collaboration among Up With Trees, the City of Tulsa, and the Tulsa Community Foundation, as well as some other partners. We set a pretty ambitious goal to raise private donations to plant 20,000 trees over the 3 years after the storm. Of that included 10,000 trees that Up With Trees would plant. And we typically plant 2-inch caliper trees in neighborhoods, public spaces, just other places like that, and we water those trees, so it's an ongoing commitment. And that included 10,000 trees planted by others. In all of the plantings, the emphasis was, again, on the right tree, the right place, and education to help ensure the long-term sustainability. Our goal was to raise $3 million in private money to fund the planting of those trees. We were very, very lucky. The Tulsa Community Foundation here in Tulsa pledged a $1.5 million matching grant, and we were able to get significant donations from some other major corporations, the Home Depot Foundation, Enterprise Rent-A-Car, Public Service Company of Oklahoma, and Kathy Taylor and her husband, Bill Lobuck, all put in $100,000 or more into that. And one of the things I think that was pretty neat, though, is that the remaining donations came from more than 700 different individuals, companies, and organizations, and, you know, some of those sending in $5 literally. We've gotten a lot of small donations as well. And we hit our deadline with this past year. We had 3 years to raise that money, and we exceeded it by $5,000, I think, the day of the deadline. So we got it pretty close, but we made that. We were out planting these trees even before the debris was cleaned up. And this is a picture here of planting, our first planting, barely a month after the storm, within the city's oldest park, Owen Park, and the surrounding low-income neighborhood. And we literally had to drag storm debris out of the way to make room for the new trees. And you can see here in this picture, I mean, there's piles of branches still there at the curb while we have the volunteers in working with the neighbors there. We had University of Tulsa students came out to participate. I think it was good for people. It was a real feel-good thing after what had been a pretty tough month for Tulsa. This is a little bit later in the season, but you can see here we've gone into a park where they were having to remove some big old trees. I mean, it was pretty sad that they were so severely damaged. But those were cut down in the background, and we're planting a new tree in the foreground. One of the things that we included as part of that, we began a Neighborwoods program here in Tulsa, which we had not had previously, and I hope many of you are aware of Neighborwoods, and if not, it's a great program through ACT. And in particular, that was a priority for us because so much of the damage had happened in neighborhoods, and as we've noted, there aren't a lot of other resources to help neighborhoods deal with these issues. So that was something that we really wanted to go in and be able to tackle. At the end of this planting season, which will end around March 31st for us, we will have planted about 7,500 of the 10,000 trees that's on the Up With Trees goal. And that includes more than 1,600 trees at city and county parks, some 3,000 trees at public schools, nearly 500 trees in neighborhoods, and more than 1,600 trees along city streets and medians, at fire stations, and other public places. And we will plant the remaining part of that, the 2,500 trees that Up With Trees will plant over the next 2 years. The other part of that goal, the 10,000 trees that others would plant, we were actually able to way exceed that. We kind of knocked that one out of the park thanks to a very generous grant from the Apache Foundation out of Houston. And they have helped fund us. They have funded for us around 40,000 trees, 3- and 5-gallon trees, and we have distributed those at no charge to area nonprofits, to schools, to government agencies, faith-based groups, neighborhood associations, and others. And as part of that program to foster sustainability, we require participants to take a short class on how to locate, plant, and maintain those trees. This is our first shipment when they first came in, and we lined up. But I mean, nice trees, as you can see, and these were very well received in the community. This is one of the classes that we offered here in our facility here in Tulsa, and I think that those were real helpful. One of the things, and it's tough because, you know, as I mentioned, in Tulsa we have just about every weather extreme you can get. So if we go and find the perfect trees that withstand ice storms, they probably won't hold up as well to tornadoes or to drought or to floods. So it's tough to take all of those things into account, but it really is, that's important. One of the things that this storm really highlighted for us was the importance of maintenance. And I know everybody knows that, but it's easy to forget. It's easy both from a private standpoint and a public standpoint to move the maintenance down to a low priority. And we know in the areas that had good maintenance, we had much, much less damage. So it's been something that we've really tried to keep a focus on. And as with the city found with their GPS system, the more information you can have about the trees that you're responsible for in advance, I think that really can help you both to immediately assess damage and then as you move forward to assess what you need to do to get back to where you want to be. So, if you have a canopy studies, you may not be able to do a GPS of individual trees like the city did, but one of the things they're trying to do now, they're implementing, is a system when we put in new street lights, new buildings, new streets, anything that gets put in as a public facility that includes trees, those other elements are GPS. We already put into a system that we've got a street light here or a sewer line here, and we're adding trees in as part of that process, so it can be done pretty little effort because we're already going through that, but it's providing a lot of information into the database that will be very useful to the city as they move forward. And then, of course, and again, I come back to the same thing, but the biggest thing that we can do when it comes to tree planting is to make the right choice when we're planting the tree. It's not just the right species, although that's a big part of it, but it's obvious, the obvious things, not planting under power lines would have made a big difference in this past storm. But, making sure, getting the education and getting that information out so we are putting the right tree in the right space. And welcome if anybody has questions specifically in particular about the Regreen program. I'd be happy to answer those. I've also included as a contact Maureen Turner, who is with the City of Tulsa, and she's over urban forestry and over much of the overall cleanup and disaster management and stuff, and she'd be happy to answer any questions if you have anything along those lines. And with that, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Anna. Daniel, let's open up the lines for questions again.
Thank you. As a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, you can press star 1. Please make sure to unmute your phone and record your name clearly when prompted. We'll take a moment to see if we have any questions.
And I will also remind folks that you can type your questions in online using that Q&A tab at the top of your screen. I want to start out by just asking you if you, and this is for Anna and also Alessandra, if you have as well, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about what it means for you in Tulsa to be planting the right tree in the right place with natural hazard mitigation in mind.
Well, I think Alessandra touched on some of those. Some of it, because we do so much planting in medians and along, the places where we plant, I think we have to think about it even more. You don't want to put trees in a median or alongside a highway that are going to create problems there with branches coming down and creating traffic hazards. You don't want branches coming down in any ice storm, but you've got to think about those things. We obviously, in certain areas that we know, one of our biggest parks here, Mohawk Park, has a lot of areas that are prone to flooding during certain times of year, so you've got to plant trees that can take the wet roots. Those types of issues. Some of it's pretty obvious stuff. We used to do a lot of, and it was beautiful. Years ago, somebody came up with putting pears in all these medians, and they grew fast, and they bushed out, and they looked wonderful until those trees matured. And then they, every time we get a windstorm or a tornado or a microburst came through, we lost more of them. I think we finally got rid of all those pears with this ice storm. It took down the rest of them that had managed to last that long. So, some trees we just won't plant at all. They're too brittle for this climate, and they're not going to stand up to any of the hazards.
Great. One question over the web. Were you able to emphasize, you sort of talked, you just spoke to this, but were you able to emphasize species diversity in your replanting efforts, and was this a component of the educational outreach you and your organization did?
Yes, it's a component. It's not something that was huge. We did it to to some extent just by the nature of the choices that we make. So we, when we do plantings, and obviously, again, that might vary a lot. What we can plant in a median along a city street is very different from what we can plant in a park and what we can plant at a school, and you have to take different considerations into each of those. We don't use a huge variety of species, but we make sure that we do use a variety of species. And when we were distributing the trees through the Apache Foundation, we were able to order those trees through nurseries. So we couldn't give greatly, I think we had maybe 10 different species available. So, we just try to make sure that we don't push or promote any one species, and we make sure that people understand that it's both from the standpoint of putting the right tree in the right place, but also from the standpoint of the overall health of the urban forest, that we do need variety.
Great. Daniel, do we have any questions over the line?
At this time, I show no questions.
Okay, great. Then we'll move straight on. We have a shy crowd that likes the web today. So one question is, during the cleanup, did any of the material get used in biomass for energy, such as chips burned at electric or heat generation or wood pellet production?
I actually think that it did. What we do here locally, so a lot of it locally, we've got a green waste site, and it's turned into mulch, and it's distributed to homeowners. In fact, that's where we get our mulch at Double Trees. It's from the city through that. But I don't know exactly where it all went, but it's part, those big piles that you saw in our pictures, those were shipped out of state, and I think some of it was used in that, and they were used in other things. I mean, you actually can make a limited amount, but there was some money made off of that because all that mulch was all used, and some of it I think was used for that. And it was the contractor, the people that we had in that were being funded through the FEMA contract made those choices when they sent it out.
Gotcha. This might be a question for both of you. Has tree hazard assessment planning been incorporated into many local, I think specifically Tulsa's, but also for other towns, into local community emergency response teams, or CERT programs?
We have not been involved in that. I do know that Maureen Turner, the person I mentioned from the city of Tulsa, I think has been somewhat involved. In our case, this disaster was so tree focused. I mean, trees were such a big, both an expense in terms of afterward of the cleanup, but also a big part of the cause of the damage when it came to power outages and stuff. I think it did highlight for people that they can't ignore that does need to be taken into account, and I know Maureen has been part of that process.
Sandra, do you have anything to add to that about CRT and the inclusion of tree assessment?
I can't think of any specific examples, although I think that's actually a really fascinating question, and I'd love to try to find out a little more about that and see what's really been done.
Great. Okay. I think this is an interesting question that gets to the issue we spoke about, the need for partnering with various different organizations and resources throughout your city and across sectors. One person asked, do any of the utility companies help with the cost for replanting appropriate trees under or near the overhead utility easements? More broadly, what was the role of utilities in helping you both with removal and then with replanting?
Yeah, they don't put enough into it, if you ask me, but they do in Tulsa, and I think this is a fairly common program. If they come and they need to remove trees that are near power lines, you can get. I live on 1.5 acres and have a whole lot of trees, and they took some out last year, and they'll give you a voucher that you can take to a local nursery and get a tree, or if you push hard enough, you can get them to come, which is what I did. They'll plant some additional trees, appropriate trees in other places on your property. So they will support it in that way. And as I mentioned, they were one of the larger donors to the overall program and are a key part of our education team so that we can ensure that stays part of the message we give out. Leland, is it appropriate? I see a couple of other questions on there that I could go ahead and answer quickly if you want that I think are directed to me, or it's probably better if you read them out first.
Yeah, sure. Well, which one, if you want?
Well, I was going to, and it kind of got buried. Somebody asked about the cost per tree, so I just wanted to quickly answer that, at least in our program. From a budgeting standpoint, we use $300 a tree. That's roughly, and that covers the cost of purchasing the tree. And as I said, we do 2-inch caliper trees, so the cost varies depending on the species quite a bit. And then that's the cost of planting the tree. And then the significant cost for us is that we go out for 2 to 3 years in water, and our watering season, it seems, becomes longer and longer every year. So, we'll end up watering sometimes 7 to 8 months out of the year. And so that's about half the cost of the tree is going out there and doing the maintenance. And then I also see that somebody had asked about the school system. Do they have urban forestry or maintenance staff who will be caring for the trees? And they do. They're not specifically arborist trained, but we sat down beforehand and worked with them pretty extensively. We have planted at dozens of schools, but we worked with the central maintenance staff and kind of went over what they can do, what we can do. And that is one of the issues that I mentioned earlier when we have to look at, the differences in different places. We ensure that we try to plant trees that are going to be lower maintenance for them because they do have limited resources, trees that can easily be mowed around, trees that won't need as much, trimming and pruning down the roads and things like that. So those are things that we try to take into account when we're working with specific customers, I guess you can call them.
Great. I think one final question that I've got here online. We'll probably wrap up soon after that. Prior to the storm, did the Tulsa's forestry department or parks department or anyone have a tree maintenance plan or a natural hazard emergency plan with a contract? Or was it something that you sort of had to then improvise on the
Yeah, they, as I said, they had done the GPS. I don't think that was done more with maintenance in mind than it was. I don't know that anybody was envisioning any kind of natural hazard that would have that kind of tree impact. So they had done that. There was not a natural hazard emergency plan as it related to the urban forest. Or any contracts in place. That is one thing that they discovered, that they could have saved some money and could have moved a lot quicker if some of those contracts were in place beforehand. And that is something that I think that they have done now, and they would advocate for other communities. You can establish some of those contracts in advance for the tree removal, for the tree assessment, for the mulching, whatever types of things, and be better prepared, if that comes up to move more quickly. And they do have that now.
I think that's a great suggestion. Daniel, do you have any other questions over the phone?
We do show one question.
Great.
That comes from Priscilla Files. Your line is open.
Yes, this is Priscilla Files. I'm with the Galveston Island Tree Conservancy, and y'all probably know we lost 40,000 trees due to Hurricane Ike, and we're in year 2 of replanting 25,000 of those trees. And my question really concerns the fundraising aspect of what you've done. Specifically, you had I think you said a $1.3 million matching, or 1.5.
Yes.
And really, that's what our big holdup is. Of course, like everybody, is fundraising. And how did you go about getting the matching grant? That's what I wanted to ask.
Well, I will give Kathy Taylor an awful lot of credit. She was a wonderful mayor, and this was something that she was passionate about. We also are very blessed that the Tulsa Community Foundation is sort of an offshoot. I don't know if that's the right phrase, but George Kaiser lives in Tulsa, and the George Kaiser Family Foundation and the Tulsa Community Foundation is sort of part of his organization, and they have been huge supporters of beautification and those kinds of improvements. So that was something that they kind of right up, when we started, and it made a huge difference having that matching grant. In fact, that's how we ended up getting our little push right at the end on the fundraising. Is Kathy Taylor put up the $100,000 right when we were a couple $100,000 short, and they did it as a matching grant. So the last push, people were able to donate $10 and have it matched, by them, and then have both of those matched by the Community Foundation, and that really helps get a lot more people out. I do think if you can find even smaller matching grants, the matching grants really seem to inspire more donors.
Right, and there can be kind of a cycle of, well, I'll match if you'll get a match, and so I'll match if you'll get a match, and that's kind of we're a little bit in a spin cycle right now. We don't have to convince anybody on Galveston Island of the need for trees. to be completely denuded is, you know, it's quite the shock. But anyway, thank you very much. I appreciate your answering my question.
And you're welcome. You might also look at, I mean, I would not have thought of Enterprise being willing to, and they donated $150,000. I would not have expected that, but they are based in Tulsa and had a national push to push trees that I wasn't even aware of. So in some cases, you may have some local players that you think of more as a national, you know, enterprise that has an interest in that, and you might be able to tie those in. Same thing with Home Depot. I mean, they were very generous with us and the Home Depot Foundation, and you know, even though they're not based here in Tulsa.
Right, and they have been with us as well. We're brand new. We just started a little over a year ago. So, of course, because we just had a hurricane a little over a year and a half ago, or 2 years ago. So, and that's where we are right now. And as a matter of fact, Enterprise and Home Depot are two entities that we're working with right now. So, or trying to work with. We haven't quite got there yet. So. But they seem to be willing to help. So thank you so much again.
You're welcome.
Those are two companies that have been great sponsors for urban forestry across the country, and I'm glad that they have been having an impact locally in Galveston and Tulsa, and they're people to keep in mind. Thank you to Alessandra and Anna for bringing up some great resources, some great suggestions, and telling us, sharing your experience about how to effectively plan and react to natural hazards that threaten our urban forests. The presentation from today, both presentations, the recorded session, and an accompanying resource list will be available in about 1 week, and the Alliance for Community Trees will email everyone who completes our brief survey. We will send you the link to access those resources in the recorded session. Our next webcast is the third Thursday of next month. It's March 17th, so mark your calendars. And again, please do take 1 second to fill out the survey at this link shown here. This really helps us to refine our programs and deliver webcasts about topics you want to hear about. Thank you all for joining in today and participating in today's webcast. A huge thank you to our excellent presenters, Anna America and Alessandra Girolman, and of course to our sponsors, the Home Depot Foundation and the USDA Forest Service. Thanks very much, everybody, and have a nice afternoon.
We'd like to thank all participants for joining in today's conference. The conference has concluded. You may disconnect at this time.